Hello and welcome, friends. Tonight I will tell you a blood-curdling story about an occurrence at a sand pit. Don't you just love sand pits? They are such lovely little dunes to play at. Nothing harmful to them at all? No? Well, we'll see about that. Okay. This is a story that I heard on a Finnish radio show over 10 to 15 years ago. A radio channel was hosting a competition in order to collect the best real-life horror stories that people across the country had to tell. Well, this one was so horrible that it still sticks with me after so many years. And I also remember the caller stuttering and almost crying while telling the story, which of course also made the story more memorable. The caller, who was a young guy, started his tale by describing a dark autumn night when he, his girlfriend, and some friends were hanging around the outreaches of their town, as they often did on Saturday nights. The summer was gone, the weather was already quite cool, and the nights were dark and cloudy. This particular night, they were hanging out after having bought some bottles of beer from a local store. They drove around, but soon got tired of cruising the empty streets, and instead they decided to find a more secluded place for an undisturbed hangout where they could pop the beer cans and fool around without having to worry about getting caught doing underage drinking. They drove to the outskirts of an industrial area. And there, hugged by a forested area, there was a large sand pit where construction workers came to fetch sand to be used in their projects. The crew parked their car along the side of a small gravel road, and armed with flashlights, they navigated their way to the upper rim of the sand pit. There they sat down on the dryish sandy ground and enjoyed their day off like it's normal for any youngster in Finland to do. They made a lot of noise while lounging there on the brink of the pitch-black darkness of that secluded sand pit. After having drunk a beer or two, the young protagonist of the story started to get a little bit tipsy, and feeling rowdy and energetic, he jumped up on his 2 feet and started down the steep slope of the sand pit, just for the fun of it. He surfed down the slope with a wave of sand, cheered on by his friends who were still sitting up on the top rim of the sand pit. The guy's girlfriend also started to follow, but she was wearing shoes that got full of sand, so she was slowed down on her descent and was barely halfway down the slope when the guy reached the bottom. The young guy had a flashlight with him, but its battery was running out, so it was only capable of illuminating a reach of a couple of meters. He turned around to look at his buddies at the top of the slope, and they were hollering to each other and cracking jokes on the girl who was seemingly struggling to move along in the sliding sand. Just then the guy suddenly heard a weird sound coming from behind him. It wasn't a shriek, it wasn't a growl, but some sort of gurgling noise that seemed to be so out of place that it caught his attention right away. The guy turned around and shined the dying flashlight towards the sound. And what he saw then was something that seemed to form a lump in his throat, making it impossible to breathe. He just froze. Clawing its way across the sandy platform of the pit was a human form that seemed hurt or disabled on first glance. However, the way it was moving with hungry determination toward the guy, moving on all fours, but mostly using its hands in strong movements to help it crawl across the sand, was an indication that all of the creature's limbs were intact and working. There seemed to be very little, if any, indication of any human behavior in the way that the thing was dragging itself across the bottom of the pit. And it was making these guttural sounds while eagerly moving closer. The creature's face was covered in messy, tangled hair and beard, and the mouth was a gaping hole opened up so wide that the face was rendered otherwise expressionless. The eyes were red and watering. But what caught the guy's attention the most at that moment, when the creature was clawing in the sand and getting closer by the second, was the fact that the creature had extremely long fingernails, dirty, dark talons, the longest he had ever seen. In a flash, the guy felt adrenaline shoot up in his veins, and he turned around, shouting out with fear. "Go back up!" he screamed at his girlfriend, for she was still in the process of descending the slope. The bodies at the top of the slope grew concerned and kept hollering at him, asking what it was that he had seen down there, what was going on, what he was playing at. As the guy started back up the slope, he knew that the creature was right there, right behind him. He started struggling upward and fighting his way through sliding waves of sand, and he could hear the creature behind him gurgling and gouging sand with its strong, muscled arms right at his heels. All the while he was climbing as fast as he could, his muscles throbbing. He was expecting to feel the iron grip of a fist at one of his feet. He was so out of breath that he could shout no more. All he could do was concentrate on his climbing movements and the disgusting guttural sounds below him. He caught up with his girlfriend at about 2/3 of the way up the slope, grasped her hand and desperately started dragging her up as well. The girl was hysterical, and she made it almost impossible to advance up the sandy ridge. Faced with this impossible situation, the guy almost felt like giving up. He turned around with his flashlight in his hands and threw a glance down the slope, and there was nothing there. There was nothing. No movement, no sound, simply pitch black darkness. He had no idea at which point in time the creature had disappeared. All the way up, he had been aware of the sounds made by the Sandcrawler. It almost seemed as though the sounds had stopped at that very moment when he had reached his girlfriend. When the pair finally got to the top of the slope, none of the crew had any desire to stay there any longer. They hurried to their car, surrounded with nervous silence as they were struggling to hear if something was moving in the trees around them. In the car, when they finally got out of the woods and out to familiar streets lit by street lamps, the guy told the others what he had seen down there, and because all the others had witnessed his shock and state of panic, no one bothered to insist that what he had seen could have been a homeless, drunk person dwelling alone in the woods. In the eyes of the caller, the young guy, he had seen enough of the creature to be certain it was no homeless person. He wasn't able to explain what had happened to them, and assured the radio host that he had seen the creature too well to be able to put the vision behind him. There. Hope you enjoyed the story. This has been one of my favorite horror stories for a long time because there are plenty of sand pits close to where I live. I have no idea from which part of the country the caller was from. So who knows? Maybe this story hits home too. Bye now. It's time for a good night's sleep with the sweetest of dreams.